So this is about as short a video as I can make to explain what FTP is, how you can measure it, or I should more accurately say how you can estimate it, and what you can do once you've got that number. The actual science behind performance testing is actually pretty complex when you start to think about how you can work out angular velocity using radians, through to how barometric pressure and humidity can affect human performance. I've tried to hit the sweet spot, if you like, to try and explain what you need to know to be able to do one, but without going either too overboard or undercooking the information that I put across. So hopefully from watching this video you'll learn what FTP is, how it's measured, what it means, what we can do once we have that number, the limitations of it, and also what watts per kilo is, which is probably the most important thing to take from this video. The popularity of FTP rose with the release of this book, the brilliantly titled Training and Racing with a Power Meter, very catchy title, by Hunter Allen and Andrew Coggan, PhD. A weighty tome, it's up there with Spate's Catalogue and Tobin's Spirit Guide in my opinion. And if you really want to get into the nerdiness of this, I'd seriously recommend reading that book. And if you like arguments, you should try Googling Andrew Coggan and slow twitch. It's in no way a foolproof measure, and it will always be an estimate for the reasons outlined later. But as long as you remain consistent in the way that you do it, it can be a useful tool. I'm going to do another set of videos covering power meters, how they work, and the various different types, as well as the video going into specifics of each of the most common ways to test your FTP, including critical power. Right, let's clip in. Your FTP will be a number followed by watts. Watts is just a unit of measuring work, so the same as you might find a 60-watt light bulb or an 800-watt microwave, it's just a measure of watts. So what you might hear somebody say is, my FTP is 230 watts, or check me out, my FTP is over 300 watts. Another measure of work that you might be more familiar with is horsepower. We're used to kind of horsepower with cars, but the reason why we don't use horsepower on a bike is because 1 horsepower is equal to 746 watts. So watts are measured by power meters on bikes, and often by smart trainers too. Extensive lab testing shows that power meters' true accuracy wildly varies, so as long as they stay constant to themselves and you calibrate them properly, then you can use them as a measure comparable to themselves. I have several power meters. On my TT bike they're in the crank, on my road and cross bikes I've got hub power meters, and my turbo's got one built in. I wouldn't use the numbers from one bike on another. For example, if I estimate my FTP on my turbo, I only use that number on my turbo. In the summer when I do 10-mile TTs and I get an accurate 20-minute effort on that to estimate my FTP from on my TT bike power meter, I'll use that number on that bike. I'd never mix the two up as they're incomparable. I'll do another video on power meters, the different types and how they work. The way you do this is to do a test. The most obvious way to test yourself over an hour is to ride hard for an hour. Then you take your average watts over that hour and it will give you your FTP. But because it's the simplest, most obvious way to do it, it doesn't mean it's the easiest. Of course, sitting on a turbo or going out and riding your bike really hard for an hour and getting it really consistent for that hour is really difficult unless you're in a race situation. So unless you've got an hour's long race, something about a 40k bike ride, 25 miles for most normal humans, which is around about an hour, it's really hard to motivate yourself to push really, really hard for an hour. And that means that there are other ways of estimating your FTP. You can use it to build your training zones. There are multiple training zone theories and protocols out there, but in most cases, zone 3 is usually around about where your FTP is. And if you're running and swimming, it'll be the same. It'll be your hour threshold pace will be around about zone 3. Anything below that or anything above that is pivoting on your FTP value. So you can use your FTP to calculate your zones, or you can use an online calculator. Motivation by improvement. If your FTP goes up, you're doing something right and it makes you feel good. But of course that works the other way too. It doesn't always work out that your FTP will increase, and there are loads of variables, and this is one of the reasons why your FTP test will be an estimate. Your life stresses, your hydration, your fatigue, your motivation for doing it all get in the way. There are loads of things: humidity, barometric pressure, whether you've calibrated your turbo. All of those things might give you a little bit of a reason why your FTP value may not go up, or it may go down. But of course, if it goes up, it's really motivating, but if it doesn't, it can be demotivating, unless you know the fact that you've got loads of excuses at your fingertips. If you really know your FTP values on that power meter on that bike that you're racing on, it can really help you pace your race on race day. So for example, if you're racing a half Ironman distance race, most athletes might be racing around about 80 to 85% of their FTP. If they're doing a full Ironman distance, it might be more like 65 to 70% of their FTP value. The true secret though is watts per kilo. A lorry may put out 600 horsepower and a car 120 horsepower, but we know that most cars can go faster than most lorries. Watts per kilo gives us the power to weight, which is the true secret to being a fast bike rider. You want to be light and strong, and this is the holy grail. Why? Because muscle is heavy. A litre of muscle weighs in at just over a kilo, and therein lies the compromise. You can be super light, but you won't have much muscle. Being strong comes with a weight penalty. Let's look at three key pro cyclist types. You've got sprinters, time trialists and climbers. Sprinters have the biggest muscles due to the huge watts they have to put out at the end of a race. Time trial riders sit in the middle weight wise, as the constant power they need is a perfect balance against the endurance distance they have to do. Then the lightest of riders, we've got the climber, as they have to fight gravity. The holy grail for a Grand Tour rider such as Tom Dumoulin, Stephen Roche, Eddie Merckx is to find that sweet spot between being able to time trial and climb with the best. It's where the greatest time gaps are made. A sprinter like Eric Zabel or Mario Cipollini or Mark Cavendish will never win the Tour. To highlight the importance of watts per kilo, let's look at this scenario. We could have a 90 kilo rider pushing 300 watts for 10 minutes, but a 75 kilo rider pushing 270 watts will go faster. The 90 kilo rider is pushing 3.3 watts per kilo, whereas the 75 kilo rider is pushing 3.6 watts per kilo. So in conclusion, FTP isn't the most useful number in cycling. There are others. You've got your 5-second power, 1 minute power, peak power, 20-minute power, all these different other areas to have a look at. But FTP is a pretty useful catch-all, especially when you combine it with your weight. Watts per kilo is the most useful metric to measure and planning your improvement, because even though your FTP might come down, as your weight also comes down, your watts per kilo might improve. And that of course means you're going to go faster. So don't become obsessed by that FTP number, and don't forget to weigh yourself before you do your next FTP test. So whilst the FTP is a useful number, without using invasive techniques to gain a more accurate number, the amount of variables that go into an FTP test mean it is just that, it's an FTP estimate. So like a hybrid bike, it is a compromise, but it is a useful one if you can try and minimise the variables that go into your test each time. But because it is an estimate, if your FTP goes up, you can celebrate, but if it does go down, you've got 100 ready-made excuses right at your fingertips.